When I built a basketball court in my backyard, I figured my biggest problem might be a bad free throw percentage. Not a clipboard-wielding Karen from the HOA trespassing on my property, slapping up a public recreation zone sign like she owned the place. She didn't just claim my private court. She padlocked the gate, called the cops on neighborhood kids, and told me to submit a usage schedule for approval. What she didn't know was this: I just got appointed the HOA Licensing Officer. And her little power trip? It just turned into a career-ending layup line, with me holding the whistle. It all started on a sunny Saturday morning. The kind of morning where the air is warm, the birds are chirping, and your coffee tastes like victory. Why? Because my backyard basketball court was finally complete. Full regulation size, glass backboard, painted lines, and even a motion-activated scoreboard synced with a Bluetooth speaker. This wasn't some DIY plywood hoop screwed into a garage. This was a work of art. And it was mine, legally permitted, built on my own land, with more love and sweat equity than a home renovation show. Word got out fast. The neighborhood kids started trickling in that afternoon, wide-eyed like they'd just stepped into an NBA dream. I told them they could use the court as long as they respected the rules. No cursing, no trash, and everyone gets a turn. It was wholesome, harmless fun. But if you've ever lived under an HOA, you know there's always that one person who looks at fun like it's a personal insult. Enter Karen. I knew of her, of course. Everyone did. President of the HOA for 6 years running. She had a custom Neighborhood Harmony nameplate on her mailbox and kept a binder of HOA infractions like it was the FBI's most wanted list. She'd once cited a retired veteran for planting the wrong shade of tulip. So when I saw her standing at the edge of my backyard, arms crossed, sunglasses on, and her trademark resting disdain face locked in, I knew something was about to go sideways. She didn't knock. She didn't wave. She just marched through my side gate like it was her God-given right and started yelling at the kids to vacate the public amenity space. I walked out mid-game, wiping sweat from my brow, and calmly explained to her that this was, in fact, my backyard, my court, and my property. Actually, she sniffed, pulling out a printed sheet of something. According to Article 3, Section 9 of the HOA Guidelines, any recreational area that exceeds 400 square feet and is visible from common walking paths is automatically considered communal space unless specifically approved for private use. I blinked. You do realize that's not legally enforceable, right? You can't just annex my property like this, is the HOA version of risk. Her smile didn't move. Well, we'll see what the board has to say. That night, I came home from dinner to find a brand new sign zip-tied to my court's entrance. HOA Public Recreation Area, members only by schedule approval. My gate was padlocked shut with a cheap brass lock, and someone had left a little packet of laminated court usage request forms dangling on a clipboard. I laughed. I actually stood there and laughed out loud. The audacity was so absurd it almost deserved applause. She'd acted like a raccoon in a power suit, just claiming whatever she saw and daring anyone to stop her. But here's the thing about dealing with people like Karen: you don't fight fire with fire. You fight it with paperwork. You beat them at their own game, while wearing a referee jersey. The next day, I received an email titled Violation Notice, Unauthorized Recreational Structure. It accused me of deliberate noncompliance, warned of daily fines, and invited me to a community compliance review hearing next week. Attached were blurry photos of my own court, taken from a bush, apparently. Someone had gone full suburban spy movie on me. But as I read the email, a grin crept onto my face. Because there, in the CC field of that email, was a name I hadn't seen in a while: Carl Bremer, the outgoing HOA Licensing Officer. A good man, retiring next week, and more importantly, an old friend of mine from college. That's when the wheels started turning. I called Carl. He picked up on the first ring and burst out laughing the second I said, "You wouldn't believe what your replacement is walking into." I explained the situation, and he groaned so loud I heard his dog bark in the background. She's doing it again? We told her last year she couldn't declare people's fountains as bird sanctuaries. Carl told me the HOA had been having trouble finding a replacement licensing officer, mostly because no one wanted to deal with Karen. The position had been posted internally but nobody applied. And here's where fate intervened. I can fast-track your application, Carl said. You've got the administrative background. You're level-headed. And you're the only one brave, or petty, enough to actually deal with her. 2 days later, I was officially appointed interim licensing officer. With that title came access. Access to every document, every HOA zoning map, every meeting transcript, and, most satisfying of all, power. Because the licensing officer doesn't just approve and deny requests. They also interpret HOA charters. And guess who has final say on which amenities count as communal? That's right. I spent that evening with a glass of bourbon, flipping through bylaws with red flags popping up faster than a bug-ridden codebase. Not only was Karen wrong about my court being public, but she'd also used an outdated clause from a pre-merger edition of the HOA guidelines. The merger, by the way, had nullified that clause entirely. Her little stunt wasn't just absurd. It was illegal. I printed everything out, created a neat little packet with tabs and highlights. Then I added one final touch. A cease and desist letter for trespassing and unauthorized signage installation. The next morning, I taped the letter to her precious HOA sign. The kids were back on the court that afternoon. We played a full 3-on-3 game under the sun, music blasting, laughter echoing through the neighborhood. Karen watched from her porch, mouth slightly open, eyes burning. She had no idea the real game had just started, and I'd already won the opening tip. The cease and desist letter rattled Karen more than I expected. By the next morning, 3 emails landed in my inbox, one from her, one from the HOA's general mailbox, and one that appeared to be from her lawyer, though it was clearly a free email domain and signed, HOA Legal Enforcement Division, which I later found out was just Karen using a different alias. Her message was filled with legal-sounding jargon that made no actual sense, demanding I withdraw my abuse of power and respect community ordinances, even going so far as to claim that my vindictive use of authority would be recorded and presented at the next district board review. That last part almost made me spit out my coffee. Karen really thought she could bluff her way through a battle of bylaws with the guy who now literally held the rulebook. I wasn't just playing defense anymore. I had access to the HOA's internal files, and what I found made my jaw drop. The HOA, under Karen's rule, had been operating like a broken vending machine, sometimes taking your money, sometimes spitting back moldy chips, and always leaving you hungry for justice. First thing I noticed was that the official charter had never been updated after the HOA merged with a neighboring subdivision 3 years ago. That meant half of Karen's rules were based on expired documents. Second, they'd failed to file their annual compliance paperwork with the county. Twice. That opened the door to a massive technicality. The HOA was not currently in good legal standing, meaning any recent enforcement actions could be challenged or voided altogether. As I kept digging, it got worse. I found emails between Karen and Greg, the HOA vice president, discussing how to enforce shared land clauses more aggressively in order to justify new community development projects. There were even outlines for turning select backyards into accessible green zones. Translation: steal land under the guise of public utility. They'd even drawn up a draft for my property, without notifying me. My court was labeled as Recreational Integration Zone 4. It sounded like a dystopian playground funded by a villainous nonprofit. I couldn't believe how deep this went. It wasn't just about my court anymore. Karen was trying to slowly reshape the entire neighborhood into her personal HOA utopia. And she was manipulating an outdated set of rules to do it, betting that no one would be savvy enough, or bold enough, to challenge her. I realized then that she hadn't just padlocked my gate. She was trying to lock down the entire neighborhood, one fraudulent document at a time. That evening, as I stared at the glowing blueprints of community development phases, I called Carl again. He answered, chuckling. "Let me guess. Found the secret land grab documents?" "Yup," I said. "And I'm pretty sure they're illegal." "Oh, no doubt," Carl replied. "But here's the thing. HOA infractions usually fly under the radar. You want to stop her? You'll need proof. You'll need to catch her doubling down." I leaned back, fingers steepled. "So, let her come at me again?" "Exactly," Carl said. "Give her just enough rope to hang herself. Trust me, she will." And sure enough, she did. 2 days later, I received a formal public property usage violation notice, accusing me of limiting fair access to a shared recreational zone. She included grainy photos of neighborhood kids playing on my court, photos I knew for a fact she took from behind my fence, through a gap in the hedge. That alone was creepy, but the kicker? She'd now scheduled a community tribunal to decide the future of my backyard. That's when I really started to move. I created a formal HOA ethics review request. As licensing officer, I had the authority to initiate one if there was suspicion of misconduct by board members. I filled it out and submitted it to the HOA Oversight Committee downtown. Karen's little club was about to get a surprise inspection. Meanwhile, I continued my deep dive into her past decisions. One thing I learned quickly: Karen wasn't just annoying, she was careless. She hadn't kept proper records of previous approvals, often skipped formal votes, and relied on her executive power to ram through decisions. That's a massive no-no. HOAs must document every decision, every vote, every citation. The moment someone audits those records, and now I had the authority to initiate that audit, the whole facade crumbles. But the real turning point came when I accessed the HOA's surveillance grant application from last year. Buried inside was a map. One Karen had drawn up to apply for Community Improvement Fund. That map listed my backyard as proposed basketball facility for communal use. It was dated months before I even built my court. She'd planned to take it all along. I stared at that time-stamped PDF, stunned. She never wanted to punish me. She wanted to steal the credit. So I made some plans of my own. First, I reached out to the parents of the kids who played on the court. I told them what was happening and asked them to sign a statement saying I'd allowed their kids to play safely and freely. Every single parent signed without hesitation. Then I drafted a press release. Nothing crazy. Just a little announcement about how the new licensing officer was hosting a community transparency day to review recent HOA initiative. I sent it to the local paper and posted it to the HOA's bulletin board. Karen's reaction came fast. She sent a furious group email calling my event unauthorized, unethical, and potentially destabilizing to the neighborhood harmony. I responded with one sentence. As licensing officer, it is my duty to ensure transparency, community involvement, and lawful HOA conduct, something I take very seriously. And that's when she made her biggest mistake. She called the police. Not just a noise complaint or trespassing accusation, she claimed I was corrupting minors by encouraging unsanctioned sports activity and creating a public safety hazard with unregulated gatherings. The officer who showed up was Detective Lyle, a local cop who had clearly seen more dramatic HOA feuds than most courtroom judges. He took one look at the setup, chuckled, and asked if he could shoot a few hoops while we talked. I handed him the paperwork. He reviewed it while nailing three-point shots. "Looks like you're well within your rights," he said. "She's got no grounds to interfere. This isn't public property, and you're not breaking any laws." Karen, watching from across the street, was losing her mind. Her face turned the color of a boiled tomato as she stomped away from her porch and slammed her door. As the sun set over the neighborhood that night, I knew one thing for certain. The power dynamic had shifted. Karen wasn't just fighting a neighbor anymore. She was up against the licensing officer. And the game had officially gone from recreational to professional. The morning after Detective Lyle's visit, my front yard looked like someone had declared war with paper. Dozens of identical flyers littered my grass, taped to my fence, and even stuck under my windshield wipers. Each one bore the HOA logo, with a suspiciously off-center alignment, and read, "Notice: Recreational Zone 4 temporarily seized for summer programming. No unauthorized use permitted. Violators subject to fine." At the bottom, in Comic Sans of all things, it said, "Approved by HOA Board and Community Chairwoman." Community Chairwoman? Karen had promoted herself now? What was next, HOA Supreme Commander? I picked up one of the flyers, still half asleep and holding my morning coffee. There was no official stamp, no board vote record, and certainly no signature from me, the licensing officer. But it didn't matter. Karen was playing her favorite game. Act fast, create chaos, and hope no one notices the rules until it's too late. This time, though, I wasn't just a frustrated neighbor. I was the one person with the authority to call foul and throw the whole thing out. Before I could even collect all the flyers, I heard the familiar squeak of Greg's golf cart turning the corner. He always rode it like he was patrolling a military base, wearing sunglasses too big for his head and an HOA vest he made himself. He stopped at the edge of my driveway and did a slow, awkward nod, like he was trying to project confidence but had absolutely no idea how to deliver bad news to someone holding a full binder of HOA violations against his team. "Hey Nate," he said, voice cracking slightly. "Just doing a little morning distribution." "Uh-huh," I said, holding up the flyer. "So who exactly approved the temporary seizure of my backyard?" Greg opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, then settled on, "Well, Karen said the board voted last night." "That's interesting," I replied, stepping forward. "Because as licensing officer, I require a minimum 48-hour notice before any vote that affects zoning, usage rights, or recreational designation. And I didn't get one. Which means that vote, if it even happened, is invalid." Greg scratched his head. "Yeah, but Karen said." "I don't care what Karen said, Greg. I care what's written in the bylaws. And the bylaws say that what you just did qualifies as unauthorized notice posting and temporary land seizure. That's a minimum of 3 violations. You want to add littering to the list." Greg immediately started peeling flyers off the nearest lamp post. By noon, Karen had sent another barrage of emails. This time, she went full dramatic. She claimed I was weaponizing my title and sowing discord in a peaceful community. She referred to my basketball court as a disruptive magnet for unsanctioned gatherings and potentially illicit behavior, which was ironic considering her wine club once got so drunk they started line dancing on someone's roof. I decided it was time to go on the offensive. I compiled all the evidence: photos of the flyers, the fake seizure notice, the unauthorized signage, timestamps of her unsanctioned vote, and witness statements from 3 neighbors who confirmed she delivered them herself. I sent the entire packet to the HOA Oversight Committee with the subject line: "Formal Ethics Complaint, HOA President Abusing Power." But I didn't stop there. That afternoon, I showed up at the clubhouse for what Karen had scheduled as a private board session. As licensing officer, I had the right to attend any and all official meetings, especially if community zoning was discussed. When I walked in, I saw Karen, Greg, and 2 other board members seated around a table with stacks of papers and coffee cups that said, "HOA Strong." Karen's face froze when she saw me. "Didn't expect to see you here," she said through a thin smile. "I'm licensing officer," I replied. "You should expect to see me at everything now." The meeting was already shady. No minutes were being taken, no agenda had been posted, and the only thing on the whiteboard was a crude drawing of the neighborhood with red XS over several backyards, including mine. They were plotting something, and they were sloppy. Karen launched into a fake presentation about community recreation revitalization, using a folder labeled Phase 1. She claimed the plan was to unify neighborhood amenities under a single, shared vision. She didn't mention that the only amenities being unified were on private property. I raised my hand. Were any of the homeowners listed in this revitalization plan informed or consulted? Karen hesitated. We planned to reach out once the board had consensus. And how did you reach consensus without public notice or a formal vote? Greg looked like he wanted to melt into his chair. That's when I pulled out my phone and hit play. I had been recording the meeting. Legally, I was allowed to. As licensing officer, my job included documenting potential procedural violations. The room fell dead silent as Karen's own voice echoed through the speaker, outlining her plan to fast-track reclassification of problematic lots and quietly rezone where possible. Karen lunged across the table to hit the stop button. "This is out of context," she barked. "I've got the whole context," I said calmly. 3 hours of it. And a formal ethics complaint already filed. Karen's face went pale. I stood up, straightened my stack of folders, and said, "I'm initiating a full audit of the HOA's zoning practices, land usage records, and community designation vote. Effective immediately. All pending programs are frozen." Karen screamed that I was overstepping. I reminded her that her temporary seizure order was null, and that under Article 5, Subsection 2, only the licensing officer can authorize or override land designation disputes. She tried to argue, but the other board members were already backing away like she was radioactive. The next morning, I returned to my backyard with a bolt cutter, a cup of coffee, and an audience of amused neighbors. I clipped Karen's illegal padlock off my gate and tossed it into a recycling bin. Then I put up my own sign. Private property, community use by owner permission only, back in business. That evening, the court came alive again. Music played. Kids shot hoops. Parents watched from folding chairs. Laughter filled the air. And Karen? She watched it all from her window, blinds barely open, seething. But she wasn't done yet. Around midnight, I got a notification from the HOA system. A new document had been filed. An emergency bylaw addendum, declaring any new recreation spaces subject to retroactive community review and control. No vote. No approval. Just a single digital signature. Karen. She was trying to change the rules again, mid-game. But what she didn't know was that I had already triggered a county compliance review. Inspectors were coming. Oversight was watching. And the next move? It was mine. The county inspector arrived in a beat-up SUV with a clipboard the size of a legal textbook and an expression that said he'd seen one too many suburban turf wars. His name was Harold, a grizzled man with a salt and pepper beard, steel-toed boots, and the demeanor of someone who'd rather wrestle raccoons than argue with HOA presidents. As soon as I greeted him at my driveway, he looked up from his paperwork and asked, "So where's the nutjob trying to turn private property into a community petting zoo?" I pointed toward Karen's house without hesitation. He gave a single nod, adjusted his sunglasses, and said, "Let's get started." The audit had officially begun. For the next 2 hours, Harold combed through every document I had meticulously organized. He reviewed zoning maps, permit applications, screenshots of Karen's self-authored bylaws, and especially the audio recording from the secret board meeting. He barely reacted to anything until he heard Karen casually say, "If we call it a community asset, they won't fight it, until it's already ours." Harold paused the audio and muttered, "She's done." After that, we toured the neighborhood. Harold took pictures of signs Karen had put up without authorization. He noted the lack of safety measures on the so-called shared paths she claimed justified the seizure of my basketball court. He stopped in front of the clubhouse and raised an eyebrow at the rickety deck that looked like it was being held together by desperation and peeling paint. "That clubhouse is technically in violation of 3 county codes," he said, snapping photos. "Unpermitted renovations, exposed wiring, and structural instability. You know what that means." It means she's been weaponizing code enforcement without even following it herself, I replied. Bingo, Harold said, scribbling notes furiously. While he continued his inspection, I returned home to check the HOA's internal database. As licensing officer, I now had full access to their historical decision logs, and what I discovered was even worse than I imagined. Karen had been greenlighting home additions, deck expansions, and landscaping changes for her inner circle while denying nearly identical requests from residents she didn't like. It was petty corruption wrapped in a floral-printed newsletter. One particularly egregious file showed that Karen approved a garden extension for Greg's wife that pushed their fence 3 feet into what was technically a drainage easement, something that's not only a violation but could have caused flooding issues during heavy rains. Meanwhile, she'd fined a single mom for putting up a kid's sandbox too close to a bush. It was time to hit back harder. I drafted a comprehensive violation summary and emailed it to every homeowner in the neighborhood. The document, titled Transparency Update from the Licensing Officer, detailed Karen's misuse of authority, false zoning claims, and her manipulation of bylaws. It also included Harold's preliminary findings and a gentle reminder that an emergency HOA board meeting was being called, to determine whether the current leadership still reflected the best interests of the community. The response was instant. My inbox exploded with support. Residents who had previously been silent out of fear now shared their stories. One elderly couple revealed Karen fined them for a wind chime noise violation. A father of 3 said Karen tried to force him to take down his kid's treehouse, claiming it attracted raccoons. Someone even uploaded a video of Karen yelling at teenagers for laughing too loud near a community bush. Harold's final report came in the next day. It was brutal. He found 9 active violations committed by the HOA board itself, including Karen's unauthorized structure additions, Greg's easement encroachment, and 2 unpermitted utility modifications made under the guise of community beautification. The final nail? The clubhouse had to be closed immediately due to safety hazard. Any events scheduled, including Karen's upcoming Community Leadership Gala, were canceled indefinitely. Karen's reaction was a masterclass in denial. She sent out a frantic neighborhood-wide email declaring that the inspector was clearly biased and that my role as licensing officer was tainted by personal vendetta. She demanded a vote to revoke my position, claimed she was initiating her own audit, and announced a surprise board meeting, without giving the legally required notice. But the tide had already turned. I showed up to the emergency board meeting with a portable projector and a printed binder titled Operational Failures Under Current HOA Leadership. The room was packed. Over 50 residents had come, most of them carrying copies of my violation summary. Karen sat at the head of the table, red-faced and barely blinking, flanked by Greg, who looked like he was wishing the earth would swallow him whole. I calmly walked through each of the documented violations. I played audio clips. I showed before and after photos. I read aloud from Harold's report, highlighting the legal ramifications of each code breach. Every time Karen tried to interrupt, I simply said, "You'll have your turn to speak," and continued. When it was finally her turn, she stood up and launched into a monologue about sacrifice, duty, and how leadership meant making hard choices. It would have been somewhat convincing if she hadn't referred to herself in the third person halfway through and accidentally admitted she'd altered minor details on zoning maps for clarity. I turned to Greg and asked if he'd co-signed any of those changes. He looked at the floor and said, "I just followed directions." The crowd groaned. Then came the vote. According to HOA protocol, any board member can be removed if 2/3 of the attending community members vote in favor during an official meeting. I handed out anonymous ballots and set up a simple box on the table. 15 minutes later, the results were read aloud. Karen, removed by 87% vote. Greg, resigned on the spot. For the first time in years, the neighborhood erupted into spontaneous applause. With Karen gone and the board effectively dismantled, I appointed an interim council made up of volunteers who had experience in planning, law, and finance. We began rewriting the HOA bylaws from the ground up, with clear protections to prevent abuse of power and clauses ensuring no resident could ever again find their backyard seized by a rogue president on a personal crusade. The basketball court, of course, was returned to its rightful status as private property. I added motion sensor lights, upgraded the fence, and installed a camera system, not out of paranoia, but because, let's face it, a Karen in defeat is more dangerous than a Karen in charge. That weekend, we hosted a neighborhood barbecue right there on the court. Kids played, parents mingled, and for once, no one had to worry about surprise fines or unauthorized flyers appearing in their bushes. Even Harold showed up, wearing a HOA compliance inspector, not your enemy shirt someone had made as a joke. He dunked on Greg's replacement during a one-on-one and went home with a plate full of ribs. It finally felt like a community again. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't finished. Because the last thing she did before leaving the meeting? She handed me a crumpled envelope with a single sentence inside. "This isn't over." I smiled. Because neither was I. Karen's cryptic message sat on my desk for days, taunting me with its vagueness. "This isn't over." That was all it said. No threat, no plan, just the kind of ominous posturing that would make a lesser man lose sleep. But I didn't flinch. I knew Karen better than she knew herself now. She wasn't the type to let go quietly. She'd go underground, stew in her bruised ego, and then resurface with a poorly thought-out vengeance play that would blow up in her face. And sure enough, she did. It started with a series of anonymous complaints filed to various county departments. Zoning, code enforcement, noise regulation, even animal control. Someone claimed I was harboring unlicensed exotic pets because they'd heard strange chirping during the night. That one was particularly entertaining since the chirping came from a birdhouse I built with neighborhood kids. The same kids she once tried to ban from chalk drawing on the sidewalk. These reports came in so frequently that even Harold called to check in. "She's still at it, huh?" he muttered over the phone. "Tell you what. Next time she files something ridiculous, I'll send someone to inspect her property instead. Let's see how long she likes being under the microscope." Despite her sabotage attempts, the neighborhood was thriving. The new interim HOA board, comprised of actual rational adults, began making improvements based on community input. We scrapped Karen's arbitrary restrictions on front yard decor. People were free to display garden gnomes, rainbow flags, or 10-foot inflatables if they wanted to. The clubhouse was undergoing safety renovations, and most importantly, we updated the HOA bylaws to protect homeowner rights, include accountability measures, and limit any one board member's influence. Karen had spent years centralizing power. We just made sure no one could ever do that again. But even with the system rebalanced, I had one final move left. Karen had committed multiple violations, but most of them hadn't reached the threshold of criminal charges. They were petty, calculated infractions that added up like grains of sand until you had a whole beach of nonsense. So I decided to hit her where it hurt the most: reputation. Using my access as licensing officer, I compiled a formal community misconduct dossier, complete with evidence, testimonies, and Harold's inspection findings. Then I shared it with every HOA in a 50-mile radius. Most HOA boards stay in touch, like a loose alliance of bureaucratic overlords. Karen had always fancied herself a regional authority, often attending workshops, networking events, and even writing the occasional guest column in HOA magazines about enforcing harmony through structure. The moment word got out about her removal and the reasons behind it, her name became toxic. I received thank you emails from 3 nearby HOAs, all saying they had narrowly avoided bringing her on as a consultant. One even said, "You just saved us from a floral apron-wearing tyrant." Karen's response was oddly quiet at first. No more flyers, no more shouting matches, no new fake roles she could assign herself. But then, one morning, she re-emerged, not in the neighborhood, but online. She had created a blog. Karen's Corner, HOA Reform from the Outside. It was every bit as unhinged as you'd expect. She claimed she'd been framed by a rogue officer with a basketball agenda, and wrote long rants about how HOAs were being corrupted by recreational extremists. She even posted a list of neighborhood threats, which hilariously included me, Harold, the interim board, and a 9-year-old girl named Lucy who apparently laughed too loudly near her fence. People in the neighborhood started reading the blog like it was a satire column. Every time Karen uploaded a new entry, someone would print it out and post it at the community mailbox with red marker annotations like, "Best delusion this week." Or, "Who hurt you, Karen?" The mockery only fueled her further, but she was losing her audience faster than she could type. Meanwhile, I doubled down on the positive changes. I converted the court into more than just a playing space. It became the community hub. We held weekend pickup games, evening movie nights projected onto the side of my garage, and even brought in food trucks once a month. Local businesses started sponsoring little tournaments, and we set up a donation system to provide new gear for kids who couldn't afford it. It was exactly what a neighborhood was supposed to be, a space where people belonged, not just obeyed. Then came the final surprise. A letter from the county clerk's office, notifying me that the HOA Licensing Office had received so much positive feedback regarding my actions that they were officially offering me a permanent seat on the regional HOA Oversight Board. Apparently, word had spread. People liked how I handled things, with structure, humor, and a complete refusal to bow to petty tyranny. I accepted the position and made it clear. I wasn't just there to rubber stamp forms. I was going to make sure every community learned from what we'd endured. Karen, meanwhile, had filed one last desperate appeal to the neighborhood board, demanding a formal character review. She claimed she had been unjustly removed, that I had used psychological warfare, and that the community had turned into an anarchic playground under my watch. Her appeal was reviewed, voted on, and denied within 20 minutes. She moved out the following week. No grand farewell, no final stunt. Just a moving truck, a few cardboard boxes, and a snapped garden gnome left by the curb. No one waved goodbye. No one offered to help. For the first time in years, peace settled over the street like a fresh snowfall. No flyers. No surprise citations. Just the sound of basketballs bouncing, sprinklers running, and neighbors actually talking to each other without fear of being reported. As for me, I was out on the court that Saturday, sun high in the sky, music playing from a portable speaker, and a line of kids waiting for their turn in a three-point shootout. One of the dads came up to me, clapped me on the back and said, "You didn't just win the battle. You changed everything." I smiled and looked over at the freshly repainted lines, the new benches we'd installed, and the mural on the side of the court that read, "Community starts here." Then I saw it, just across the street, barely visible behind a curtain. A pale face, watching through the window of a house still for sale. Karen. She hadn't left yet. But it didn't matter. Because her reign was over. And my court? It was here to stay.